Deep in the uncharted Amazon rainforest, one man's vacation turned into a desperate fight for survival. After a catastrophic plane crash left him stranded miles from civilization, with nothing but his wits and determination, Daniel Reyes embarked on a harrowing 19-day journey through one of Earth's most unforgiving environments. This is his remarkable story of resilience, ingenuity, and the indomitable human spirit when faced with nature's most brutal challenges. The small aircraft shuddered violently as it pierced through the dense cloud cover. Daniel Reyes gripped the armrests, his knuckles white with tension. The vacation to Brazil had been spontaneous, a necessary escape from the mounting pressures of his architectural firm in Chicago. Now, as the plane lurched and dipped through turbulent air currents, he wondered if spontaneity would be his undoing. "Just some rough weather," the pilot Joe shouted over his shoulder in heavily accented English. The man's casual demeanor did little to settle Daniel's nerves. Through the rain-streaked windows, all Daniel could see was an endless expanse of emerald canopy below. No towns, no roads, just miles of untamed jungle. The first explosion came without warning, a deafening boom followed by a violent jolt that sent Daniel's head slamming against the cabin wall. Alarms blared, red warning lights flooded the cockpit. The second engine gave out moments later, and suddenly they were falling, spiraling toward the dense forest below. "Brace, brace now," Joe screamed, fighting with the controls as the ground rushed up to meet them. Daniel's world dissolved into chaos, screeching metal, shattering glass, the terrible splintering of trees. Then darkness. When consciousness returned, it came in fragments, pain radiating through his left leg, the metallic taste of blood in his mouth, the smell of fuel and smoke. Daniel opened his eyes to a nightmare. The aircraft's fuselage had been torn apart, scattered across a small clearing. Joe's body hung limp in the pilot's seat, his neck bent at an impossible angle. Daniel was alone, injured, and utterly lost in one of the most dangerous environments on Earth. The realization came slowly, through the fog of shock and pain. His phone had no signal, not surprising given their remote location. The plane's radio was destroyed. The emergency locator transmitter was nowhere to be found. Daniel had been an avid backpacker in his younger years, but nothing had prepared him for this level of isolation, for the absolute vulnerability of being completely disconnected from civilization. With trembling hands, he took inventory of his supplies: a half-empty water bottle, some snack bars from his backpack, his wallet and passport useless here, a small pocket knife and the clothes on his back. It wasn't much to survive on, but it would have to do. Night was approaching quickly. Dangerous predators would soon begin their hunt. Daniel's leg throbbed. A deep gash ran from his knee to his ankle, but miraculously nothing seemed broken. He needed to clean the wound, find shelter, and formulate a plan. "Think, Daniel," he muttered to himself, his voice strange and hollow in the humid air. "Just think." The jungle closed in around him, alive with the sounds of creatures hidden from view. Somewhere in the distance, a jaguar roared. Daniel shivered despite the oppressive heat. He was no longer a respected architect from Chicago's Gold Coast. Here he was prey. Survival would depend on his wits, his determination, and perhaps most importantly, his ability to overcome the paralysis of fear. Because the Amazon was unforgiving, and it didn't care about his credentials or his dreams. It only recognized strength and the will to live. And Daniel Reyes refused to die in this green hell. The first night was the hardest. Daniel fashioned a makeshift shelter from the least damaged section of the plane's fuselage, dragging himself and his meager supplies beneath the twisted metal. The wound on his leg needed attention. Using water from his bottle, he cleaned it as best he could, then tore strips from his cotton shirt to create a bandage. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by strange calls from the jungle and the constant, gnawing fear that something might find him. When dawn finally broke, streaming through gaps in the canopy, Daniel emerged from his shelter with renewed determination. He needed to make decisions. Stay with the crash site and hope for rescue, or attempt to find civilization. He remembered something Joe had mentioned during their brief flight. They were following the tributary of a larger river. Rivers meant villages, towns, people. If he could find the water, he might find his way out. Daniel buried Joe, saying a quiet prayer over the simple grave. He couldn't carry much, so he had to choose carefully. He salvaged a plastic tarp from the plane, some wiring that might serve as cordage, and a small metal container that could be used for boiling water. He filled his water bottle from a small stream near the crash site, hoping it wouldn't make him sick. "I'll find my way out," he promised Joe's grave, "and I'll make sure they know where to find you." With his injured leg protesting each step, Daniel set out in what he hoped was the direction of the river. The jungle was dense, alive, and seemingly determined to block his progress. Vines snagged at his clothes, thorns scraped his skin, and the humid air made each breath feel like drowning. But he pushed on, using his pocket knife to hack through the undergrowth when necessary. By midday, exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him. His water was half gone, and the protein bar he'd rationed provided little energy. The wound on his leg had begun to throb anew, the bandage soaked through with blood and sweat. Still, he couldn't stop. To stop was to surrender. When he finally heard the sound of running water, Daniel nearly wept with relief. Stumbling through the last barrier of vegetation, he emerged onto the bank of a wide, swift-flowing river. The water stretched at least 50 yards across, its surface a murky brown from sediment. But to Daniel, it was the most beautiful sight imaginable, a lifeline to the outside world. He collapsed at the river's edge, drinking deeply despite knowing the risks. The cool water soothed his parched throat, restored some fragment of hope to his exhausted body. Tomorrow he would follow the river downstream. Civilizations always built along waterways. All he had to do was keep moving. That night, Daniel slept in the hollow of a massive tree near the riverbank. His dreams were vivid, disjointed, memories of his life in Chicago intermingled with surreal visions of the jungle. In one particularly vivid dream, his ex-wife Marisol stood at the edge of the river, her eyes sad. "You always said you wanted adventure," she said, her voice carrying over the water. "Is this enough for you, Daniel?" He woke with tears on his face and a hollowness in his chest that had nothing to do with hunger. The jungle seemed to press in closer, as if sensing his moment of weakness. Daniel forced himself to his feet, wincing at the pain in his injured leg. He couldn't afford self-pity. Not here, not now. As he washed his face in the river, a movement caught his eye, a small motorboat puttering around a bend downstream. Daniel's heart leaped. Without thinking, he began to shout and wave his arms frantically. "Help over here, please." The boat continued on, the sound of its engine fading into the distance. Either they hadn't seen him or they had chosen to ignore his cries. Daniel sank to his knees, despair threatening to overwhelm him. Then a new thought emerged. If there was one boat, there would be others. Where there were boats, there were people. Hope rekindled, he gathered his supplies and began his journey downstream, following the riverbank where possible, cutting through the jungle when necessary. The going was slow and painful. His injured leg dragged behind him and hunger gnawed at his stomach. He supplemented his dwindling food supply with fruits that looked similar to ones he'd seen Joe eat during their brief stop in Manaus. On the third day, fever set in. The wound on his leg had become infected, red streaks spreading outward from the gash. Daniel knew he was in trouble. Without antibiotics, the infection could kill him as surely as any predator. He bathed the wound in the river as best he could, but the relief was temporary. That evening, delirious with fever, Daniel thought he saw lights flickering through the trees. Voices, too distant but distinct. He called out, his voice weak, but received no response. Were they real or hallucinations brought on by his deteriorating condition? He couldn't be sure, but in his fevered state he continued toward the perceived lights, stumbling and falling repeatedly. When darkness fully descended, Daniel found himself in another clearing, this one clearly man-made. The remnants of a campfire smoldered in its center. Someone had been here, and recently. He collapsed beside the dying embers, adding small sticks from his surroundings to revive the flames. The fire's warmth was comforting, a small reminder of human civilization in this wild place. As he drifted in and out of consciousness, Daniel heard rustling in the undergrowth. His hand tightened around his pocket knife, though he knew it would provide little protection against the jungle's more dangerous inhabitants. But what emerged from the darkness wasn't a jaguar or a snake. It was a child, a boy no more than 10 years old, with dark skin and wide, curious eyes. The boy spoke in Portuguese, words Daniel couldn't understand. When Daniel responded in English, the child retreated slightly, his expression wary. But he didn't leave. Instead, he observed Daniel from the edge of the clearing, occasionally disappearing into the jungle only to return minutes later. "Please," Daniel said, his voice cracking. "I need help, ajuda." The boy disappeared again, but this time when he returned, he wasn't alone. An older man followed, weathered face, strong build, clothes worn but practical for the environment. He carried a machete at his waist and a rifle slung over his shoulder. The man studied Daniel with calculating eyes, taking in his injured leg, his Western clothing, his obvious distress. "American?" the man asked, his English heavily accented but understandable. Yes, Daniel replied, relief flooding through him. My plane crashed, the pilot died, I've been trying to find help. The man conferred with the boy in rapid Portuguese, then turned back to Daniel. I am Raphael. This is my grandson Tiago. We are rubber tappers. Our village is 2 hours from here. Can you walk? Daniel tried to stand but collapsed almost immediately, his infected leg unable to support his weight. Raphael frowned, then spoke again to Tiago. The boy disappeared into the jungle once more. He goes for help, Raphael explained, kneeling beside Daniel to examine his wound. The older man shook his head grimly. Very bad, needs medicine. For the next hour, Raphael tended to Daniel's fever, offering him water and applying a poultice of crushed leaves to his infected leg. The plant mixture strung fiercely, but after a while the pain in his leg seemed to dull slightly. My people have lived in the jungle for generations, Raphael explained as he worked. We know its dangers but also its gifts. Many plants here can heal. When Tiago returned, he brought 2 more men from the village, carrying a makeshift stretcher between them. With Raphael's guidance, they carefully moved Daniel onto the stretcher and began the journey through the dense foliage. The trip was a blur of pain and fevered hallucinations for Daniel. At times he thought he was back in Chicago, arguing with clients over design specifications. Other times he was a child again, following his father through the Puerto Rican neighborhoods of their Humboldt Park community. Through it all, Raphael's steady voice anchored him to reality, speaking sometimes in English, sometimes in Portuguese, but always calm, always reassuring. When they finally reached the village, a collection of simple wooden structures perched on stilts to protect against flooding, Daniel was barely conscious. The villagers gathered around, their faces curious but kind. He was carried into one of the larger buildings and laid on a bed of woven mats. A woman with silver-streaked hair and gentle hands took over his care, applying new poultices and coaxing him to drink a bitter herbal tea. For 3 days, Daniel drifted between consciousness and delirium as the infection raged through his system. The village healer, Maria, he later learned, Raphael's sister, stayed by his side, changing his bandages and administering her remedies. When his fever finally broke on the 4th day, Daniel woke to find Raphael sitting beside his bed, whittling a small piece of wood. The American lives, Raphael said with a small smile. Maria said you would, she is never wrong about these things. Daniel attempted to sit up, wincing at the stiffness in his body. How long have I been here? 4 days, the infection was bad. Without Maria's medicine you would be dead. The bluntness of Raphael's assessment was startling but probably accurate. Daniel looked down at his leg, now wrapped in clean bandages. The angry red streaks had receded, and though the wound still throbbed, the all-consuming pain had diminished. Thank you, Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know how to repay you. Raphael shook his head. No payment, the jungle took your plane, nearly took your life. We have balanced the scales, that is all. Over the next several days, as Daniel's strength gradually returned, he learned more about Raphael and his community. They were descendants of both indigenous people and the rubber tappers who had come to the Amazon during the rubber boom of the late 19th century. They lived simply, but were not completely isolated from the modern world. Several villagers had radios, and a few had even traveled to Manaus for education or medical care. The village had no direct connection to the outside world, no telephone, no internet. But Raphael explained that a larger settlement with such amenities could be reached by boat, a journey of about 2 days downstream. Once Daniel was strong enough to travel, Raphael promised to take him there. In the meantime, Daniel became part of village life. He shared meals with Raphael's family, learning to appreciate the simple but flavorful dishes prepared from local ingredients. He watched as Tiago and the other children played complex games involving seeds and stones, their laughter a stark contrast to the dangers that lurked just beyond the village perimeter. Maria continued to tend to his wound, which was healing remarkably well under her care. She spoke no English, but they developed a kind of sign language, supplemented by the few Portuguese words Daniel had begun to learn. Through these limited communications, he came to understand that Maria had lost her husband to a jaguar attack years earlier, that she had 3 grown children who had moved to cities, that she had never left the jungle but knew its secrets better than anyone. One evening, as Daniel sat with Raphael on a platform overlooking the river, the older man asked him about his life in America. Daniel found himself speaking freely about his architectural career, his failed marriage to Marisol, the emptiness he'd felt despite his professional success. I came to Brazil looking for something, Daniel admitted. I didn't know what until now. Raphael nodded, his weathered face thoughtful in the fading light. The jungle strips away pretense, it shows us who we truly are. And who am I? Daniel asked, half joking, half serious. A survivor, Raphael replied simply. But more than that, I think, a man seeking his place in the world. The words resonated with Daniel in a way he hadn't expected. His life in Chicago suddenly seemed distant, almost dreamlike. The constant pressure to succeed, to impress, to accumulate, it all felt hollow compared to the raw authenticity of existence here. In the jungle, life and death walked hand in hand, each day a gift rather than a guarantee. As his physical strength returned, Daniel found himself helping with village tasks, fishing in the river, assisting with repairs to structures damaged by recent rains, even learning the basics of rubber tapping from Raphael. The work was hard but satisfying in a way his architectural projects had never been. Tiago appointed himself Daniel's unofficial guide, proudly showing him the forest paths near the village, teaching him to identify which plants were safe to touch and which would cause painful rashes. The boy's resilience and knowledge were humbling. At 10 years old, Tiago navigated the jungle with confidence that Daniel, despite his recovery, still couldn't match. 2 weeks after his arrival at the village, Daniel was strong enough for the journey to the larger settlement. Raphael prepared his boat, a sturdy wooden vessel with a small outboard motor, while Maria packed supplies for the trip. The entire village gathered to see them off, many offering small gifts: a woven bracelet, a carved wooden figurine, a pouch of medicinal herbs. As they pushed away from the shore, Tiago ran alongside the river, waving frantically. "You will come back," he called in halting English, words he must have practiced specifically for this moment. Daniel felt a lump form in his throat. "I'll try," he called back, not wanting to make promises he couldn't keep but unwilling to say a definitive goodbye. The journey downriver was peaceful compared to Daniel's earlier ordeal. Raphael navigated with the ease of someone who had traveled these waters his entire life, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of the region's history. They passed other small settlements and occasionally other boats, their occupants exchanging waves and shouted greetings with Raphael. "The river connects us all," Raphael explained. "It is our highway, our lifeline." That night they made camp on a small island in the middle of the river, safer, Raphael explained, than sleeping on the shore where predators might prowl. As they sat beside their small fire, Raphael unexpectedly broached the subject of Daniel's future. "When you reach Santarém, you will contact your embassy. They will arrange your return to America." Daniel nodded. It was the logical next step, what anyone in his situation would do. And yet the thought of returning to his former life no longer held the appeal it once might have. "What if I don't want to go back?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. Raphael studied him thoughtfully. "The jungle has changed you, this happens sometimes. But remember, to choose this life is to accept its hardships as well as its beauty." "I understand that. Do you? You have seen only a small part of our existence. The seasons here are not like in your country. When the rains come, the river rises, brings illness, makes travel dangerous. When the dry season is too long, we struggle for food, for medicine. It is not an easy life." Daniel looked out over the dark water, reflecting the stars above. "My life in Chicago wasn't easy either, just in different ways. At least here the challenges feel real, meaningful." Raphael didn't respond immediately, instead adding more wood to their fire. Finally he said, "Finish your journey, speak to your family, your government, then if you still wish it, return. The village will welcome you." By mid-afternoon the next day, they reached Santarém, a city of nearly 300,000 people situated at the confluence of the Amazon and Tapajós rivers. After weeks in the jungle and the small village, the noise and activity were overwhelming to Daniel. Cars honked, music blared from shops, people hurried past without the leisurely pace he had grown accustomed to. Raphael guided him to a small hotel near the waterfront, explaining Daniel's situation to the proprietor in rapid Portuguese. The woman behind the desk looked at Daniel with open curiosity, then nodded and handed over a key. Raphael paid with crumpled bills from a small pouch. "I have arranged a room for 3 nights, Raphael said. "The hotel has telephone, internet. You can contact your embassy, make arrangements. I will stay until tomorrow morning to help if needed, then I must return." Daniel felt a sudden panic at the thought of Raphael leaving. The older man had become more than a rescuer. He was a friend, a guide, a connection to the world that had simultaneously nearly killed Daniel and somehow brought him more fully to life. "Thank you," Daniel said inadequately, "for everything." Raphael shrugged, uncomfortable with the gratitude. "Rest now. Tomorrow we will find the American consulate." The hotel room was simple but clean, with amenities that would have seemed basic in Chicago but now felt luxurious. A real bed, running water, electricity. Daniel showered, watching as weeks of jungle grime swirled down the drain. His reflection in the bathroom mirror was startling. Beard grown wild, face thinner, eyes somehow different. Older perhaps, or simply more aware. That evening, he used the hotel's computer to send emails to his business partner and his sister, explaining briefly what had happened and assuring them he was alive and recovering. He didn't mention his conflicted feelings about returning, his growing attachment to the life he had glimpsed in Raphael's village. Those were conversations better had in person, if at all. If you're watching this video right now, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment below with your location, and be sure to subscribe for more incredible survival stories like Daniel's journey through the Amazon. The next morning, Raphael accompanied Daniel to the American consulate, a small office in a modern building near the city center. The consular officer, a brisk, efficient woman named Karen, expressed appropriate shock and sympathy when Daniel explained his ordeal. She took down all the relevant details, made copies of his passport, and assured him that arrangements would be made for his return to the United States as soon as possible. "We'll need to file a report about the crash site," she explained. "The Brazilian authorities will want to recover the pilot's remains and investigate the accident." Daniel provided the approximate coordinates as best he could recall them, describing the clearing where the plane had gone down. Karen nodded, typing his description into her computer. "You're incredibly lucky, Mr. Reyes," she said, glancing up at him. "Most plane crashes in the Amazon don't have survivors, and even those who survive the initial impact rarely make it out of the jungle." "I had help," Daniel replied, nodding toward Raphael, who stood quietly by the door. Karen followed his gaze, seeming to notice the older man for the first time. "Of course, the embassy would like to recognize those who assisted you. There might be a reward." "No," Daniel interrupted firmly. "Raphael and his community helped me because it was the right thing to do, not for any reward. Their way of life is private. They prefer to be left alone." Karen looked slightly taken aback but recovered quickly. "I understand. Well, it should take about 2 to 3 days to process everything and arrange your flight back to Chicago. Do you have somewhere to stay in the meantime?" "The hotel is arranged," Raphael said, speaking English for the first time since they'd entered the consulate. "I must return to my village today, but Daniel knows how to reach us if needed." The finality of Raphael's statement hit Daniel harder than expected. This was goodbye, at least for now. As they left the consulate and walked back toward the waterfront, Daniel struggled to find the right words. "I don't know if I'll see you again," he finally said as they reached Raphael's boat, "but I want you to know that what you and your community did for me, it changed more than just my physical condition. It changed how I see the world." Raphael nodded, his expression softening slightly. "The jungle teaches if we are willing to learn. Remember what I said, finish your journey here, then decide. The village will remain." They clasped hands, neither man entirely comfortable with more demonstrative farewell. Then Raphael climbed into his boat, started the motor, and pulled away from the dock. Daniel watched until the small vessel disappeared around a bend in the river, carrying with it a man who had saved not just his life but perhaps his soul as well. The next 3 days in Santarém were a strange limbo for Daniel. He received medical attention at a local clinic, where doctors marveled at the healing of his leg wound under Maria's care. He purchased new clothes to replace his tattered jungle attire. He ate in restaurants, slept in a comfortable bed, used his newly acquired Portuguese phrases with shopkeepers and hotel staff. But something was missing. The convenience of city life, which he had once taken for granted, now felt somehow empty. The constant noise grated on nerves that had grown accustomed to the natural rhythms of the jungle. Even the food, while plentiful and diverse, lacked the simple satisfaction of meals shared around the village fire. On the morning of his scheduled departure, Daniel sat in a small cafe near the hotel, nursing a cup of coffee and watching boats move along the river. His flight to Manaus would leave in 3 hours, connecting there to an international flight back to the United States. His former life awaited, projects on hold, clients expecting his return, the sleek apartment overlooking Lake Michigan. A local newspaper lay on the table, and though he couldn't read most of the Portuguese text, one headline caught his eye: Desenvolvedor Americano promete novo resort deluxo na Amazonia. The accompanying photo showed a smiling white man in an expensive suit, gesturing toward architectural renderings of what appeared to be a massive resort complex. Daniel flagged down a waiter, and in his limited Portuguese supplemented with gestures, asked for a translation. The young man explained that an American developer was planning to build a luxury resort about 100 kilometers upriver, promising jobs and economic development. Local environmental groups were protesting, concerned about the impact on the fragile ecosystem. Something cold settled in Daniel's stomach. He knew this story, had lived versions of it throughout his career. Development often came at a cost, and that cost was usually paid by those with the least power to resist. Communities like Rafael's could be displaced, their way of life deemed expendable in the name of progress. Almost without conscious decision, Daniel found himself walking to the small airline office where his ticket awaited. The woman behind the counter smiled as he approached. "Mr. Reyes, your documents are ready. The flight to Manaus leaves at 11:30. Daniel hesitated, his hand halfway extended to take the ticket. In that moment the path before him seemed to diverge: return to Chicago, to the familiar patterns of his former life, or step into the unknown, into a world that had nearly killed him but also awakened him. "I've changed my plans," he heard himself say. "I won't be taking that flight." The woman's smile faltered. "But the American consulate has arranged everything, your connection to Chicago." "I know, please tell them I'm grateful for their assistance, but I've decided to stay in Brazil for now." Outside the airline office, Daniel took a deep breath, feeling simultaneously terrified and exhilarated by his decision. He had no concrete plan, only an instinct that his journey in this country wasn't finished. He would need to contact his business partner again, arrange for more extended absence, perhaps eventually a formal sabbatical. There would be complications, paperwork, questions from family and friends. But first, he needed to return to the village, to speak with Rafael. Not to ask for sanctuary. Daniel had no illusions about his ability to simply insert himself into their community permanently, but to explore possibilities. Perhaps he could use his architectural knowledge to help them improve their structures while respecting their traditional methods. Perhaps he could serve as a liaison between their isolated world and the encroaching development that threatened it. Whatever form it took, Daniel knew only that he couldn't simply walk away from the profound connection he had formed with this place and these people. The Amazon had nearly claimed his life. Now, in a different way, it was claiming his future. He purchased supplies for the journey upriver, practical clothes, medicines, gifts for the village children. Finding transportation would be the challenge. Without Raphael's guidance, Daniel would need to hire a boat and perhaps a guide familiar with the river system. It would be expensive and potentially risky, but no more so than the crash that had started this entire odyssey. As he walked along the waterfront, evaluating different vessels and speaking with potential guides, Daniel felt more certainty with each step. The architectural engineer from Chicago was still part of him, but no longer defined him completely. The jungle had revealed other aspects of his character: resilience, adaptability, a capacity for genuine connection untethered from professional advantage. By sunset, he had secured passage on a supply boat heading upriver the following morning. The captain, a grizzled man named Eduardo with a network of relationships throughout the river communities, knew of Raphael's village and agreed to take Daniel there for a reasonable fee. That night in his hotel room, Daniel wrote longhand letters to his sister and his business partner, explaining his decision more fully than he had in his brief emails. He didn't expect them to understand immediately, but hoped they would eventually respect his choice. In Chicago, he had been building structures. Here, he had the chance to help build something more important, a bridge between worlds that were rapidly colliding. As he sealed the envelopes, Daniel remembered something Raphael had said during their journey downriver. "The jungle strips away pretense. It shows us who we truly are." In the crisis of the crash and its aftermath, stripped of the trappings of his former life, Daniel had discovered aspects of himself long buried beneath professional ambition and societal expectations. The revelation wasn't that he belonged in the jungle. He harbored no romantic delusions about going native or abandoning his culture entirely. Rather, it was that he belonged wherever he could be fully present, fully engaged with the reality around him, fully connected to both the challenges and the joys of existence. For now, at least, that place was along the Amazon, in a village perched on stilts above the floodplain, among people who had saved his life and in doing so, had shown him a different way to live it. The journey back upriver was considerably more comfortable than Daniel's initial, desperate trek through the jungle. Eduardo's boat was well maintained, with a small cabin where passengers could shelter from rain or sun. They stopped at various settlements along the way, delivering supplies and collecting products to sell in Santarém: rubber, Brazil nuts, handcrafted goods. Daniel observed these interactions with growing interest. There was an economic system here, informal but effective, that connected these isolated communities to the larger world. Yet that connection remained tenuous, vulnerable to exploitation and disruption from outside forces. 3 days into their journey, Eduardo pointed to a tributary branching off from the main river. The village you seek is there, perhaps 4 hours upstream. The water is lower now, makes navigation difficult. We must be careful. As they turned into the narrow waterway, Daniel felt a growing sense of anticipation. What would Raphael and the others think of his return? Would they welcome him or see him as an intrusion? He had made a life-altering decision based on feelings and experiences that might seem clear to him but mystifying to others. The landscape grew increasingly familiar, the particular shape of the tree canopy, the patterns of vegetation along the riverbank. When they finally rounded a bend and the village came into view, Daniel's heart raced. Nothing seemed to have changed in the weeks since his departure. The stilted structures stood strong against the threat of flooding. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Children played along the shore. Eduardo guided the boat toward the crude dock where Daniel had departed with Raphael. As they approached, a small figure broke away from the group of children and ran along the riverbank, shouting excitedly. Even from a distance, Daniel recognized Tiago, the boy's distinct voice carrying across the water. By the time the boat was secured to the dock, a small crowd had gathered. Raphael pushed his way to the front, his weathered face registering first surprise, then something like understanding as he met Daniel's gaze. "You have returned," he said simply as Daniel stepped onto the dock. "I have," Daniel confirmed. "Not just for a visit, I want to stay to learn to help if I can." Raphael studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "The jungle called you back, this happens sometimes." Around them, the villagers murmured among themselves, curious about this American who had left, only to return by choice. Maria stepped forward, examining Daniel's leg with professional interest, nodding approval at its continued healing. Tiago tugged at Daniel's hand, already pulling him toward the village, eager to show him changes or accomplishments made during his absence. Daniel allowed himself to be led, feeling a sense of rightness, of having made a decision that aligned with some deeper truth he was only beginning to understand. That evening, as the community gathered for the evening meal, Raphael formally introduced Daniel to everyone, explaining in Portuguese that he had chosen to return to learn their ways, to offer his knowledge in exchange for their wisdom. The declaration was met with varying reactions, some welcoming, some wary, all watching to see what this stranger would become among them. As darkness settled over the Amazon, fireflies dancing above the river and the sounds of night creatures rising from the forest, Daniel felt both farther from and closer to his former self than he had ever been. The journey that had begun with a plane crash was continuing in ways he could never have imagined. The jungle had nearly killed him, then had saved him, and now offered him a chance at a different kind of life. Not easier, not safer, but perhaps more real. In the coming months, Daniel would face challenges both expected and surprising. He would learn the rhythms of the forest, the techniques of survival honed over generations. He would use his architectural knowledge to help strengthen the village structures against increasing flood risks brought by climate change. He would serve as an intermediary when government officials or developers came with promises or threats. And he would discover that home was not a place but a way of being, fully present, fully connected, fully alive to both the beauty and the danger that surrounded him. The jungle had stripped away his pretenses, showing him who he truly was. Now he had the chance to live as that person, navigating between worlds just as the river navigated between banks, finding his path one day, one challenge, one connection at a time. As the village fire burned low and the stars wheeled overhead, Raphael leaned close, his voice barely audible above the night sounds. "The Americans have a saying, 'Not all who wander are lost.' Perhaps this is true for you." Daniel smiled, the phrase striking a chord deep within him. "Perhaps," he agreed, "or perhaps I was lost before and only now have I been found." The older man nodded, satisfaction in his eyes. The jungle gives what is needed, takes what is offered, a fair exchange. A fair exchange indeed, comfort for authenticity, security for purpose, the known for the possibility of something more meaningful. As Daniel looked around at the community that had saved his life and now offered him a place within it, he felt profound gratitude for the twist of fate that had brought him here. The crash that had seemed like the end of his story had been merely the beginning of a different one. Alone in the jungle, he had found not just a path to physical survival, but a route to a kind of rebirth. Against all odds, Daniel Reyes had escaped death only to discover something perhaps even more elusive, a life fully and purposefully lived.